Welcome back. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carasoft on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Maury Haber, the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Information Security Officer at Beyond Trust, and Frank Bergoglio, the Global Public Sector Strategist for SailPoint. In the last segment, we heard Frank talk a little bit about this idea of operationalizing, putting all the pieces in place. And Frank, I have to say, you hurt my feelings a little bit. I just got to be honest here. When you said, HSPD 12 is good, but maybe more bad than good, I'll let it go. I get what you're saying, but don't worry. But let me talk to Maury a little bit here and talk a little bit about this operational piece. Since you have the job that, probably every day you got to look at what's going on, the foundational pieces, and you really have to make identity work for your organization and for your agency. How do you make it operational?
Well, let's just start with the basic concepts that Frank and I have been talking about. Let's just say you've got the human aspect down. However you've inventoried it, however you've used authoritative and unauthoritative sources, and you get that under control. That's pretty much well documented and a standard practice. It's the non-machine pieces that can get you, going to where you need to be, but it's the machine and automation that tends to cause people the biggest stumbling block. My background started with Skivvy and ACAS and doing vulnerability assessment scans across federal networks. And what we would request all the time was for a domain account to do a credentialed vulnerability scan. That was an account that had admin access across the board to everything. And in this day and age, that's how lateral movement works. You would never do anything like that, let alone give any owner of that account permissions to use it, whether it's an application or not. So you have to step back and think about when you're doing this identity management and the privileges an account has, you have to then consider zero trust. Each asset that you're connecting to should be unique, have a unique set of credentials to do something like a credential scan or patch management or something else where there's no agent. But also in the context of just in time, you do not have to have these identities and their associated accounts present all the time. They should be available when change control or assigned to, and then removed operationally or disabled when they're not. That's really critical for automation, because if they're on all the time, 168 hours a week, then a threat actor can basically use automation or other machines to compromise the federal network system or state and local government. And that's not good because they're not being monitored typically the same way. So understanding how to get the human element, it's great. It's something we can operationalize, but all of the automation and service accounts and everything else behind the scenes really takes some understanding and planning and ensuring that the accounts associated with those owners do not have global access across the board. That's a really high risk.
Maury, I have to say, I'm a little surprised here because usually you don't say it's the challenges are the people, not the IT. And here you seem to be saying a little bit the opposite, that the machines and the automation may be the stumbling block. Maybe dig a little deeper, because you need to set it up in such a way that you know who's on your network, what roles and responsibilities do those people have, but there's also so much data that has to get input that maybe a lot of times agencies just don't have the data to make automation and the machines work as well. Is that your basic premise?
Sort of. Think of it this way. The threat actor is targeting the human. Once they gain access to the human's account, they want to escalate privileges. Now, if you're doing good identity and account management, especially around privileges, that user only has a finite set of systems they can hit. That's it. However, if they can scrape memory for malware, keystroke log, or any of the advanced attack techniques, they're going to look for accounts that have global or more than one system access. That's how they're going to get lateral movement. They're going to use those vulnerability accounts. They're going to use those malware service accounts. They're going to use other types of credentials and even tokens or certificates that are present that give them a more broader access into the environment. That's a part of identity management too. Who is the owner of those machine identities? So yes, the threat actor might be coming in through the person first. And if you've already done a great job limiting and controlling that identity management, their next goal is going to be finding out what's operating under the hood to go attack something else.
Frank, jump in here and talk a little bit more about this idea of operationalization. From your perspective, we're seeing a big move around software-defined perimeters, software-defined networking. We're seeing, a lot of agencies, there's a lot of talk about zero trust. But what are some of the things that you're seeing agencies do to start operating this idea of identity and access management?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about frictionless access, right? And that's really where we need to get it to in this modern security architecture, let's call it. And that frictionless access, there's a lot of touch points there, whether it's, day one provisioning. We now have context about a user, about a new employee or new contractor, that we can at least grant them some day one access based on least privilege to be effective when they first sit in the chair. But as that person matures in the organization, then we have things like access request processes that have approvals where necessary. We're still in a very highly regulated government industry where we need to account for who has access to what, and auditors want to know when, where, why, and how that access was obtained. So there's that whole governance process that needs to be there, but we need to keep it easy. Maury mentioned just-in-time access, and that is absolutely required. But there's a balance between what we can grant on day one, what's just in time, and what is call it an interrogated request that requires the approvals and different policy checks and things like that. So we're seeing agencies get to that maturity level. It's been really some are obviously much more advanced in their request processes, trying to reduce that burden on the help desk. We have agencies that are integrating with their ITSM to really have one single spot to request access from. So it's to me, operationalizing the identity is really about using the data we have and enabling frictionless access. And like I said, that could be in a various different components.
I want to go to something that's come up several times during our conversation, this idea of privileged users. And I think it's one of the biggest challenges agencies face is reducing the administrative access to a lot of these privileged users. I think Maury brought up this idea of just in time, and Frank, you brought this idea up as well. When you have access for a short amount of time, then your access is cut off. You really don't need it anymore until next time. But there's also have to be a balance. How do you strike that balance? Because if you're a privileged user, there's a reason why you're a privileged user, maybe to fix things, to secure the network. So how do you achieve that balance?
Sure, I'll take a first stab at it. When we say privileged user, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're given administrative or root rights. There are triggers and methods, techniques for granting privileged access to things where you actually don't know those credentials or you don't have a certificate. And those techniques are really important in the concepts of just in time, because you can elevate the application, like using a run as, where you yourself are not elevated. But it's even better not to do that, to elevate the application by using it by tokenization, by actually elevating it within the operating system so that its credentials running elevated are local only and can't be used against anything else through the network. So the concepts of just in time are not just, hey, I'm going to give you an account now, or I'm going to enable an account now. There are many techniques to get there. And once you say, I'm going to use it for just this runtime and then terminate it afterwards, those privileges for that application are truly gone. And this is even true for working from home or wherever you may be. You might need to connect to a new home printer, or you've had to change your Wi-Fi network. How are you getting that remote support to change that? How are you getting local admin rights? That could be quite painful for many organizations to support all the help desk calls and everything else. And there are techniques that you can use and applications that you can use to grant distinct just-in-time administrative rights to functions and tasks that you approve of so that the end user can do their job. And ultimately, if you're going to say, yes, this person works from home, they are allowed to add a printer, they're allowed to change their system clock, they're allowed to run an updater, you then place that properly in an identity governance solution as a role. This user has permissions to do this at home, and then you've actually taken the role delegation of the identity to the user account down to the asset with all the attributes needed for them to do their job unrestricted. And operationally, that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely, Maury. You nailed it.
It's interesting when you talk about printing. It's what I hear from so many CIOs these days is we can't really do this printing thing at home. So they actually figured out digital signature. It always makes me laugh a little because it's like, it's not really that new. It's kind of been around. One of the things when we talk about privileged users is what is a privileged user? How do you define that? Is there some kind of ceiling? Is there some kind of floor at every agency? Maury, start us out.
It's actually a very difficult problem. In the commercial world, a privileged user is generally a power user or admin or root. In my experience with federal government, a privileged user is any user that has access, period. So this is even a guest user has privileges of guest. So when talking to vendors or the colleagues, make sure you define loosely what you consider privileged. It's anybody that has access or if it's administrative or root. In the conversation that we're having here, we're talking about any user that has access that could cause harm, a denial of service, a breakage, an outage, or an embarrassment, or steal data. So you have privilege to do something bad. And that's not only as an insider threat, but also as an external threat.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time for today. This has just been a tremendous conversation. So first, let me thank my guests. Maury Haber is the Chief Technology Officer and Chief Information Security Officer at Beyond Trust. Maury, thank you so much for your time today. And Frank Bergoglio is the Global Public Sector Strategist at SailPoint. Frank, also thank you so much for your time. I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search innovation.